My grandpa died when I was just 6. I barely remembered the funeral. I just know that I was sad. He was a good grandpa. The best one you could have. I remember so little, but the warm feelings whenever somebody mentioned him were there. So naturally, I was really sad when he died. But as I was just a kid, I turned to more fun stuff as the years passed. I did not think about my grandpa for a long time, but when I was 16, I found a large suitcase that belonged to him. There were so many things inside, ranging from his old collection of stamps to some letters. I was immediately interested in them, as I saw that most of them were addressed to my grandma. She died long before I was born, when my dad was just a kid. He never told me anything about her, as he didn't remember. But now, I found a whole treasure of letters. There wasn't anything too exciting in them. Mostly my grandpa and grandma saying how they loved each other, planning their wedding, and my grandpa's overwhelming joy upon realizing that she was pregnant. The joyful tone of the letters quickly deteriorated as my grandma was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer soon after my dad's birth. She died when he was just 2 years old. The last letter of the bunch was sent to my grandpa's best friend, Mr. Oliver, and in there he was telling him about his sadness and grief upon losing his wife. But it was the last paragraph that caught my attention. "I'm telling you, Ollie, I know that you think that I'm silly, but I know him. Ferdinand took her away, just like he did to my dear Greta." I spent quite a lot of time staring at those words. I had no idea who Greta or Ferdinand were. As far as I knew, there were no two people of such names in my family. I've shown the letters to my parents as well, and they didn't know either. I knew that Mr. Oliver lived in a home for the elderly 2 blocks away, but I didn't know if he was still alive. I wanted to ask him. For some reason, I needed to know. I called the home, and yes, Mr. Oliver was alive. He was rocking his 78th year, so I figured I might pay him a visit. He used to play with me until he had a stroke when I was 10, and from that point on, he wasn't the same. His family put him into the home, as they weren't able to take care of him anymore. Mr. Oliver was still able to recognize me. He greeted me as an old friend and offered me some chocolate. We spent some nice time calmly chatting. It was hard to talk to him as he was nearly deaf. Luckily for me, he began remembering his best friend in the middle of our small talk. I told him that I came to ask him something about my grandpa. He immediately raised his eyebrows in anticipation, so I showed him the letter and asked if he could tell me more about Greta and Ferdinand. He spent such a long time looking at the letter, I could see tears form in his eyes as he was remembering his old friend's handwriting. He took a deep breath and told me this story. "You know, your grandpa wasn't born here in the USA. He had to flee here from Austria once the Nazis took over. He was born in Graz and lived in Vienna. When he was just 18, he married one beautiful girl named Greta. He told me that she was a tailor and a very sweet soul. They met while he was in college in Vienna. They stayed together for almost a year, but their relationship ended when she was found dead in the Danube. Nobody could explain why. Your grandpa lost his mind then, my dear. He kept talking about Ferdinand. I didn't know who that man was, but your grandfather was absolutely certain that he took the life of his beloved wife. A year later, Nazis began the Anschluss, and he had to flee to America. As his roots were Jewish, he told me all of this when your grandmother died. It completely broke him, but he was willing to live for his son, your father. I believe that he invented Ferdinand in order to cope with his loss. When I left the house for the elderly that evening, I was baffled. I didn't know anything about my grandpa's past, but I wasn't alone. My dad didn't know anything about it either. We were now determined to find out something about my grandpa's life while he was still in Europe. Fast forward 20 years, Dad managed to find my grandpa's old address in Vienna by tracking down his surname. It took him so long, but now that he retired, he had more time on his hands. I had 2 weeks off of my job next month, so I booked a flight to Vienna. My grandpa's old house wasn't a house at all, but a small apartment where he lived during his college years. Now, it was owned by a kind young couple. They were very happy to show me around, but I couldn't find any belongings of my grandpa. The couple told me to ask the landlord and gave me her address. It took a while to find her, as I was in Vienna for the first time in my life, but I was so glad that I did. She was a sweet old lady who was very willing to help me. She told me that she found a case with Greta's things that my grandfather left in the old apartment. Greta truly was beautiful. I believe that she had ginger hair, as her face was freckled, but I couldn't really tell from the black and white photos. My youthful grandpa looked so happy while embracing her in her wedding dress. That was his first wife. I could see her old, now ruined, wedding dress in the same case, and a few newspaper articles carefully cut out and glued together. They were all about her death. Apparently, few witnesses saw her enter the tiny boat at twilight. While she was oaring, she was singing out loud, crying and screaming. She seemed to be in so much pain, and then she just simply jumped into the water. It seemed as if somebody pushed her, but she was alone in the boat. Local people called for help, but when the river police took her out of the water, it was too late. The newspapers interviewed my grandpa, and he said that he didn't understand anything, as they had such a happy and fulfilling marriage. I read all of the articles and couldn't find anything about somebody named Ferdinand. Since I didn't have any other thing to do, I took a train to Graz to try and find my grandpa's childhood home. I spent almost my whole vacation trying to find it, asking the old locals if they remembered him by his surname. One old man told me to try and find him in the city's archives, and that took forever, mostly because I'm not that great at German. But I've managed to find out that my grandpa's birth certificate and everything was moved, but it said which address to which. It seemed as if my grandpa wanted to leave Graz behind and move away to Vienna for his studies, so he took all of his stuff and managed to get citizenship in Vienna. I was so frustrated, but at least I had my grandpa's address. I've managed to find a place where he spent his childhood. It was in ruins. It wasn't exactly in Graz, but in the outskirts. It was an old cottage-like house. I was so creeped out by it, but I wanted to explore. However, I didn't find anything. I just realized that the house wasn't abandoned. It was destroyed by fire. One could clearly tell, as almost every structure was burnt. and most of the weaker materials in the house were turned into cinder. Sadly, without knowing anything more, I had to return back to the USA. Fast forward 2 years, and here I am booking a new trip to Vienna. During those past 2 years, I was searching information like a madman. There are whole lists of people who migrated to the States during World War II, but there wasn't much more info. My grandpa was among them, but the majority of his life during the war and after was hidden. So now, that is why I'm going back to Vienna. I wanted to find something about my grandpa in the city and the college archives. The city archive told me that they'll send me his birth certificate and everything else they could find, but I had to wait, so I went straight to the college. There were some problems with them, obviously, as they wanted to save the privacy even of their deceased students. I was, however, very persistent, so they allowed me to try and dig up some stuff about my gramps. And there was a whole treasure. My grandpa loved to track his day-to-day activities in a planner. He was also writing about his romance with Greta, but the last paragraph he wrote in it was clearly something. Why bother? Why, dear Ferdinand? Why did you kill her? Did you think that you would fool me by making it look like a suicide? I know that it was you. I saw you. I saw you, and you were mocking me. I know you wanted her for yourself. I know you want my life. But the destiny chose me. You took my family away. You left them to be swallowed by flames. And now you do this? And just when I found out that she was pregnant? I am leaving next week and you aren't coming with me. Upon further research, I found that my grandpa didn't have a brother. He had 2 sisters who died during the catastrophic fire that destroyed his family's home. And in his professor's report, there were often remarks about his absent-mindedness, suspicious anxiety, and obsession with ghosts. He clearly had panic attacks during his classes. Was my grandpa undiagnosed schizophrenic? Dad told me that Grandpa indeed had all those symptoms even as an adult. He was an overly protective father. He was always urging my dad never to walk anywhere alone, especially at night. He was also obsessed with ghosts. He seemed to see stuff that wasn't there. That was more apparent during stressful times. When my dad told him that he was engaged to my mom, Grandpa did not feel happiness. He could only feel fear. He wasn't sleeping at night for months, even after the marriage. He had an insane habit of sitting in the street with a gun and holding a crucifix the whole night. The neighbors had called the police a couple of times, as he would sometimes spring up. He never fired the gun, but he was aiming at random houses and nobody was feeling safe. But as the years passed, he lost that weird behavior, but he was still extremely cautious. When I was born, Grandpa was thrilled, but also terrified again. He was again keeping watch with a gun and a crucifix, but for this time, it was a little bit shorter. He was much older then, and he would often fall asleep holding a loaded gun on the front yard. My dad had to wake him up by gently kicking him from behind. Almost every time, he would wake up and scream, "Ferdinand!" But he never gave any explanation. He also never wanted to visit psychiatrists. He was afraid that Ferdinand might strike if they incapacitated him with drugs. I was so mad at my dad for not telling me anything about this, but I was even more confused now. And then came my grandfather's birth certificate from Vienna. Now, I know that this may sound insane, that you may think that both me and my whole family are a bunch of lunatics. But hear me out. It turns out that my grandfather was born as a Siamese twin. The other boy attached to him, however, became parasitic during the first year of his life, and they had to be separated. My grandpa survived the surgery, which was a true miracle, but the other boy passed away. But that happened when my grandfather was 6 months old, and his twin was given a name: Ferdinand.